period, and we see the beautiful opus mixtum of the Hadrianic period. The second phase is Antonine. To that phase belong these yellow bricks. The third phase is Severan, around 200 AD, and to that phase belong red bricks of a huge arch.
Taalvloers. Oh yeah.
Thea, we worked together way back in the 1980s in Ostia, studying bakeries, and I can remember quite vividly that there was one particular wall that you were quite excited about. It was pretty confusing. I have some photos of that wall. Do you remember it?
Oh yes, it was utterly confusing for me. At the moment I had studied brick walls for a long period already, but this was really quite a problem. You see all kinds of pieces here, and some of the lower pieces and the upper pieces were of different ages, even 100 years between them, 2nd and 3rd century AD, with some other restorations. And that can be very confusing for students, how it is possible that perhaps a more recent part is lower in the wall and a more ancient part is up in the wall. You would think they start from the bottom and up. But since a Roman wall it is not a massive wall, but it is also always consisting of a core of concrete, where on both sides, or on one side, a facing, as we call it, of masonry, brickwork, tufa, can be anything, was added. Those facings sometimes did fall off after some time and had to be repaired. And then it is possible that the upper part, as here, which is Hadrian, that is 120, 130 AD, is 100 years older than the lower part was repaired 100 years later.
Now, some archaeologists study paintings, mosaics, portraits, sarcophagi, and you chose for walls and bricks, an unlikely choice. What caused that?
Well, I think even from my earliest youth, when I was 3-4 years old, I always played with blocks, first in wood, later also in ceramic, so the real bricks, let's say, but then on a small scale for children. And I always created house walls or whatever. And so perhaps it originated there, I don't know.
How did you end up in Ostia?
Well, I was very lucky in a way, because I was staying as a student at the Dutch Institute in Rome, and there arrived quite soon a team from the Free University in Amsterdam under Professor Johannes Boersma, and they were starting a project in Ostia. And he invited me to talk with him, and then said, would you like to participate in our project and study the walls? Yeah. Yeah.
And from then on it was Ostia.
Not only Ostia, because I also worked and walked a lot in Rome.
What was the aim of the project?
The aim was to study a block in the center of Ostia. It consisted in 14 buildings, 2 large mansions, a tenement house, several shops and workshops, a bath complex and a warehouse.
That was pretty complete then.
It was a mixed lot, yes.
Now, in Pompeii, life ended in 79 AD, but in Ostia it continued for a very long time, until the 6th century. So, an enormous chronology. I have some photos here of masonry that you dated.
Yes, that is in the toilet in one of the larger houses. Like we used to have, the toilet was built under a staircase. This is a one seat, so not very common for Rome. And the masonry I found here was quite early, because the adjacent walls are dated in the 2nd century AD, but this one was older and was dated also with comparison with other walls in Ostia and Rome, in the late 1st century. That is the late Flavian period.
Now, in such confusion, obviously it will be helpful if some walls have already been dated more or less accurately. And I have photos of a few walls that were dated pretty precisely before you started your work. Can you tell us something about these walls?
Oh yeah, this is an interesting one. That's the oldest one in Ostia. This is a wall of the ancient castrum, the old fortress of the year about 300 BC, in large tufa blocks.
And it can still be seen.
It can still be seen in several places and quite high, as you see here. This is 400 years later. This is a wall well dated in the period of the Emperor Trajan, so then we are just after the year 100 AD. And this is the most popular spot in Ostia. All school classes sit here. This is also a lavatory, but then a public one for many seats. And the walls that I now concentrate on are a very beautiful Hadrian mixtum, opus mixtum, tufa blocks and interlining bricks.
Okay.
And finally, that is not much later, 20 years later, the yellow purely bricks of the Antonine age, that's about 150 AD. And here we have your bakery, the Molino, and these enormous arches were added only after the year 200, when the Emperor Severus, I think, reigned.
Many viewers may now think, okay, this is what Dr. Heere says, so it's probably true. But if I'm in an old city in Germany and I look up at an old wall, then I may read a sign saying 1888. But we don't have that in Roman walls. So how can you date them so accurately?
Well, the Romans did us a great favor, because in the reign of the Emperor Augustus, they started giving the bricks that were produced in series in large factories, they gave them a stamp of the factory. A century later, and that is during the Emperor Trajan, they did for us archaeologists an even nicer thing. They added to that stamp the year it was stamped. Now, Romans did not indicate like we do 2022 or something, but they indicated the year by the two consuls, the high officials who reigned that year. We know the whole series of consuls, so that's not a problem. And in the year 123, in abbreviation, we find these on the bricks, and that started in the year 123 AD, and I'm very happy to present one from the succeeding year, 124 AD, where the two consuls' names in abbreviation were presented. And in the second row, these are the consuls, is also named the factory it came from, owned by a certain Marcianus that we know nothing about. Unfortunately, those stamps were added only during the 2nd century and not continuously. In the 3rd and later it was very rare, but for this period we have a great help.
So now we have the basics of a wall. Great, but now what? How can it be dated?
There are different ways, but the most important thing is by looking at it carefully in different light and in different times of the day. And then describing what you see, repeating it if possible a few days later, and so go on. That's the most important thing, the visual analysis. You see the mortar between, you see if you look closer, but it's very important, the color and the substance in the mortar. You see the way it is built carefully with bricks that look more or less the same, or is it a mixed lot of bricks in color and in size, all that kind of things. And for extra security, I advise to take the measurements of a group of bricks in a wall. Well, of course, we do not know how ancient mortars and builders worked. So what their qualities was for one type of mortar or another, I cannot say, but I can say by having visualized so many of the walls that there's quite a difference from one period to another. There is a lot to be said about mortar. One thing is crucial. I always had a small penknife see how hard it was. And the best mortars, let's say of the 2nd century AD, the Trajan, Hadrian, the Antonine walls, they're very hard. You can't get inside them. That's very good. The late antique walls have usually a very bad mortar. I don't know whether they lost the practice or because the people were not trained well enough or whatever, or the money was lacking. Of course, we do not know the reasons, I'm sorry to say, but then you see that the mortar is filled with anything, pieces of marble, pot shards, even pieces of bone from some poor animal, whatever, apart from the regular mortar part. And as a consequence, the beds of mortar in that late period are also much wider. Probably, I think, because the bricks were very expensive and the mortar not, because I can't find another explanation why they would do it.
It's always a question of money, of course, so they reused material from the past.
Yes, quite a lot. Of course, mortar you can't reuse, and that's crucial because mortar is the only fresh element in any wall. Bricks or tufa or whatever can be reused at random, but not mortar. So if you are rather confident in looking at the mortar, then you can say a lot about its date already. But the bricks, yes, in the 2nd century, when the emperors Trajan, Hadrian, Antonine emperors had the large building periods, that most of Ostia was being built and also large parts of the suburbs of Rome, then all the bricks were fresh. But that declined after the year 200 AD or somewhat later, I must say, when I think also the politics of Rome declined. So I think also the large industries, and brick producing was one of the very large industries, must have felt the consequences very badly. So they reused bricks. Well, here you have an example. It's an old photograph of mine in black and white of a reused wall. It was from Ostia, and in my remembrance from the House of the Porch, but the block we researched with the Free University of Amsterdam. But here you see a late antique wall, and what you can see very carefully here are they're all from the same lot, so they have the same width more or less, but many of them are broken in two. And often we also see, like this one and this one and this one, that the sides are not straight but are on a curious angle. This means that the bricks were used before in the wall. That wall was demolished, and the bricks were cleaned of mortar and other things and built again in this wall, but because the bricks had been cleaned of mortar, which is very hard, often the bricks break into two. The shorter one we see here, for example, or the one here, or parts of the bricks are cut off, as we see here and we see here. However, the length where they are so cut off and chipped off at the front is always an indication of reused bricks. And here, more, if I were a student, I might think it's a Hadrianic wall because the bricks look like it. They may have been very well. And another example of this late antique masonry is that the mortar beds between the bricks are very wide, almost as wide as the bricks themselves.
Shall we have a look at some examples?
I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, I have some photos here. Let's have a look at them. What do you make of it?
Yeah, well, they're all from Ostia, obviously.
Yes.
This, I think, is a wall of the late 3rd century. You see also, we just discussed that mixed lot of bricks, and here the reused bricks are very clear. because you see thick ones, thin ones. You see here very long ones. I just spotted here. It may be a roof tile, don't you think? But also very small ones in length, and they have a rather large width in the mortar. Beneath, near the foundation, there's a serious, I think the wall was revetted by plaster or marble later on, that you didn't see this because it's a public building. But here you see that's quite unusual, reused square tufa blocks, you know, of the Opus Reticulatum.
Yes.
They took here as well. Very interesting. Then, here we have a wall of, as I remember well, the 4th century, mid-4th century. And here we have a mixed lot of bricks. We had in previous wall mainly bricks, but here is bricks with alternating courses of tufa, oblong blocks of tufa, not very well cut because there are all kinds of shapes, like little leaves. And the bricks also are in part a mixed lot.
Okay.
I'm looking at no, that's modern restoration, the
Yes, is
arch.
the upper part modern,
Yeah.
do you think? Yes.
The arch is it's not the way Roman, they are Roman bricks, ancient bricks, but then it's not the way they mortared it. We have the wall of the House of the Porch, one of the block of the Free University, and this is, I think, one of the very latest walls I ever noticed there. It's a secondary wall in the sense that all walls of the room were already there, and this wall was put in front of one, I think the south wall, in the 5th century somewhere.
So how much difference is there between the walls, the lateral walls here and the back wall?
About 2 centuries.
2 centuries.
The left wall here is from mid-3rd century, as large part of the House of the Porch. And the wall here that was set as a reinforcement. Did they want to install a cupola? No, that's not possible. But a vault or something? We do not know, of course, because the other wall, the old wall, looks sound enough. Yeah. But anyway, they put a wall in front of it, obviously in the 5th century with, again, if you look carefully, you see it here, it's mainly small, long bricks. And between them you see very large beds of mortar with even pieces of marble in it. And that's in the very rear of Ostia, the Piccole Terme.
Small bath.
Very small, very tiny basins, only for 1 or 2, more like our jacuzzi than like an ancient bath complex. And here also you see, this is also modern bricks, I mean modern restoration, but here you see parts of the ancient bricks, and then you see what a sorry lot it is. Sorry, I can't describe it otherwise. Mixed, all kinds of lengths, all kinds of color. And you see here that the beds of mortar and of bricks are not in a strict horizontal line, but the bricks are in a slightly undulating pattern, which is also very characteristic of late antique parts. You see it also in the city wall of Rome, in the buildings they put there in the 5th century.
This is 5th century?
I think even later, maybe early 6th, but it's so little to be dated well. It's very late.
One of the last buildings in Ostia.
Yeah.
Ostia was excavated in the 19th and 20th century, and obviously the walls needed some protection, restoration to protect them from the elements. How did that impact your studies?
Well, of course we had to trust that they put back the right parts of wall on the right ancient part of wall. We see ancient photographs of the 1930s, for instance in the Terme de Sette Sapienti, where you see enormous blocks of 2-3 meters of bricks that had come down and that they had to put up. I find it quite admirable, that the way in which they restored it, and I hope and trust that they did it on the right spot.
So at the end of your studies, did you have a little black book? Is there perhaps hidden in this house a little black book, so that if we are looking at a wall, we can leaf through the book and then look at it and say, okay, this wall is late 4th century?
I wish it were. No. It can't, you have to look at the wall again and again and again. I can say that.
What would this mean for students who wish to date a wall? How time-consuming would the effort be for them?
Well, if you have the time, as I did the first year in Ostia, working with Free University, to look at the walls, and I measured lots of bricks, that's very good, because you have to stay very close to the wall. You have to observe every detail, that kind of work. It would be quite a nice effort, and you must always think, I mean, dating a wall is not interesting in itself, but a wall is part of a building, and the building is part of a quarter, and the quarter is part of a town. And in that way, it's very interesting because you contribute to the building history, if you do it right, of that town, of that block, of that house. That is the important thing.